here can also watch. We are going to continue now where it's people that are working at the international level, not necessarily just presenting their work at the international level. Now we'll have Elizabeth Casabianca and Nina Nurminen, who are from Joint Research Center from the European Commission. The Vice President already referred to it, and they will present work on intervention to tackle loneliness across the EU before we will be moving on to Chris Minter.
Thank you, Hans. So good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the loneliness research team at the JRC, I would like to thank the organizers of the event for the kind invitation and for giving us the opportunity to contribute to today's discussion. Thank you. Okay, sorry about that. I'm here today with my colleague Minna Nurminen to talk about the work we are doing at the JRC on interventions to tackle loneliness across the EU. So for those who are less familiar with our institution, the Joint Research Center is the in-house research center of the European Commission, and its mandate is to provide independent, evidence-based research and scientific advice and support to EU policy. And Minna and I are here today as research scientists to bring what we hope are relevant elements to today's discussion. So very quickly, the agenda of our talk. I'm just going to give a brief overview of the Loneliness Project at the JRC, which we heard from the Vice President this morning. Next, I will introduce the work stream on loneliness interventions, and then I will give the floor to Minna, who will provide some more details on that, and then next steps will conclude the presentation. So why loneliness project or project on loneliness? So according to a recent JRC report, in the first months of 2020, 25% of Europeans reported feeling lonely more than half of the time. This is compared to 12% of EU citizens reporting feeling lonely more than half of the time in 2016. And these figures were also mentioned by the Vice President this morning. So of course, social distancing and lockdowns have magnified a problem that was already existing though. And although all of us have felt lonely at some point in our life, those reported are quite worrying levels of loneliness. And why should we care? Well, we have heard this morning that there are so many reasons why we should care about loneliness. It has consequences from a health perspective, but it also has consequences on social cohesion and community trust. And so this is why it's important that loneliness has the attention of policymakers. So what to do about at European level? So in the summer of 2021, upon initiative of the European Parliament, the JRC, in collaboration with the Directorate General of Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion, launched a new project to monitor loneliness in Europe. So the overall goal is to gather additional evidence to support decision-making on loneliness and social isolation. And the project includes a broad series of activities, and I will go into more detail just in a minute, and will be carried out over a period of 2 years, and the project will end in 2023. And of course, Vice President Switzer is closely following the project. So just to quote the Vice President, to effectively tackle the complex issues of loneliness and social isolation, we need first of all to fully understand them. So the purpose of the research project is to provide new EU-wide evidence and knowledge on loneliness to better apprehend the drivers, as well as the health and the consequences of loneliness at a more societal level. So, as mentioned before, the project includes a number of tasks, and they can be grouped into 4 main categories. Unfortunately, there's not much time to go into too much detail, but we can certainly answer your questions later, or even after the end of today's discussion. So the first category is the statistic analysis of existing cross-national surveys. So the report I was mentioning before, Loneliness in the EU, that's the title of the report, offers a picture of recent trends in self-reported levels of loneliness across the EU and identifies the socio-demographic and geographical characteristics associated with loneliness. The second stream of activity is the collection of new data to better apprehend the drivers as well as the health and societal consequences of loneliness. And we are actually very near to launching an EU-wide cross-national survey on loneliness, and the survey will allow us to map current levels of loneliness in the EU. And of course, this can be understood as a very important tool for an EU-wide surveillance system to monitor and map loneliness, as we were just hearing before the coffee break. Another activity included in the project is the publication of a series of literature reviews on the risk factors associated with the growing levels of loneliness, as well as on the effectiveness of interventions to prevent and cope with loneliness. And last but not least, the implementation of a user-friendly web platform to monitor loneliness across countries. And this is actually already up and running, but I will talk about it in a minute. So achievements so far. So the project's just started, as I said, in the summer of 2021, but we do have, some results, and some publications already based on this project. So first of all, we gathered new evidence on loneliness in the EU 27 through a series of publications, including reports and literature reviews. So beside the report that I was mentioning before, we know now more about the relationship between loneliness and social and civic behavior, and about the risk factors for loneliness. We gathered and shared knowledge with practitioners, researchers, and loneliness intervention experts through an expert meeting on loneliness interventions held in December 2021. And also we held a seminar on loneliness organized within the community of practice on fairness of the JRC. And as mentioned before, we have a new web page where all of this material is collected and is constantly updated. So I really encourage you to visit this website, and it's continuously updated with new content. Now, let me turn to our second item on the agenda, the work stream on loneliness interventions. Before I delve into this, I would like to provide a definition of what we mean by loneliness intervention. So we define a loneliness intervention as a program or an initiative that specifically aims at tackling and reducing loneliness among the targeted population of the participants. It can be an initiative promoted by public entities, NGOs, or private businesses, implemented at the local, regional, or national level. So 3 main activities fall under this umbrella, and I will talk more in detail about each of them just in a minute. So these activities are: the first one is a literature review on the effectiveness of loneliness interventions. Then we are mapping loneliness interventions in the EU. And the third element is an interview with intervention experts, interviews with interventions experts. So all of these elements are connected, and the analysis and results of one feed into the other two. So regarding the literature review, from an academic perspective, and for those who are familiar with this jargon, it can be defined as a second-order systematic review. And we are working on this with Dr. Susanne Bucher and Mistress Aline Beckers from the Ruhr University of Bochum in Germany. It is based on 23 systematic reviews and 9 meta-analyses on the effectiveness of interventions and the effectiveness. And it adds to the existing literature by comparing meta-analyses, so an overview of them and their results, and this is currently missing. And because existing literature now compares single studies but not meta-analyses and their effect sizes. And the goal of this work would be to get a full picture of the literature on loneliness interventions and identify their effectiveness. So, of course, the work is still in progress, and so, we just have some preliminary results. But what we find is that most meta-analyses and reviews, there is some evidence that, there are some interventions that actually work and that are effective, and we were mentioning some of them in the previous roundtable. Of course, there are many interventions, and they differ for their focus. The other thing we found is that most meta-analyses and reviews focus on older adults, so there's really a need for analysis of different age groups, especially the younger age groups. So the second element is the mapping of interventions across the EU. And this is more of a practical contribution, while maybe the literature review was more of a scientific contribution. And here the goal is to understand what works to tackle loneliness and identify gaps. So maybe what should be there in practice, but because it's, the literature says that it should be there, but maybe it's not. And also based on this mapping, we will create an online repository of interventions for policymakers, practitioners, and lonely individuals, and this online database will be available on the webpage that I was previously mentioning. So preliminary findings. So there are a relevant number of interventions across the EU. So the map that you see on the slide shows the number of interventions we found so far, and the work is still in progress. We did find a few, or we encountered a few challenges for a set of countries, especially because of language barriers, difficult to get information online, and maybe lack of visibility of the intervention themselves. And for a few countries, because maybe we didn't have the language barriers and the information was easily accessible, we did find a number of programs. The main actors delivering these interventions are NGOs and public entities at a local level, municipalities, but this makes sense if we think that these entities are those most nearer to the population, and so they know better what the population needs. And there are often small-scale programs and one-off interventions, and so especially during the pandemic, these kind of interventions have, of course, mushroomed. So the third element is the interview with experts from the EU. Here I cannot show you any preliminary findings because it's an activity that we are planning for late spring, early summer 2022. But the idea would be to interview between 20 and 30 experts, so those who effectively design and implement loneliness interventions. And the goal would be to add a qualitative element to our intervention work and expand from the literature review and the mapping with experts' insight on specific interventions, what works, how to make the intervention more effective, and what might be the challenges and how to overcome them. So I will now give the floor to Minna.
Thanks a lot, Elizabeth, and good afternoon, everyone. I will continue with the next part. So basically, based on our work so far with interventions, we can see that they can really be categorized along different dimensions. So here you can see some of them. For instance, the level of implementation, the type of organization, level of intervention itself, the target group, and of course the type of service varies. So we can really see that loneliness interventions are often complex and multifaceted, And of course, any categorization always is a simplification of the reality. Also, the effectiveness of interventions can vary across these dimensions. For instance, something that works for the older adults in some context might not work for a younger age group. So it's quite clear that no one-size-fits-all solution is out there, yet we believe that there are some success factors that can be identified, and that's what we aim to do with our research. And next, we wanted to really provide a couple of very practical and concrete examples of interventions that we have come across in our mapping. These are interventions across the EU, and that all of them have some quite interesting elements that we think can be inspirational for the community working on loneliness interventions. Starting with the one from Spain. So the city of Barcelona has developed a city-level strategy to address loneliness. And this strategy is accompanied with an action plan, which has very concrete actions to be taken looking up to 2030. And what is interesting in this strategy is also that the authors really elaborated the lessons learned during the drafting process. And we think this can be really helpful for other cities and municipalities that might be developing similar plans. And these lessons learned related to, for instance, data. So what kind of data could and should be collected at the city level? Or how to create synergies across the city as an organization to really have a holistic approach to address this issue. And in fact, there is a similar initiative in the city of Pau in France, so something certainly interesting to follow. Moving from the city level to more community level, this is something that the Vice President already mentioned in the morning, so I won't go into the detail. Many of you might have heard about this intervention in Helsingborg, in a small port city in southern Sweden. It's a multicultural and multi-generational living space with the aim to promote social cohesion and combat loneliness through a new way of living. And in practice, they had an apartment house with some 50 apartments, and they had a really diversity of residents living there and moving there. And the organizers of this program really made sure that these people come from very different backgrounds. They might have different values, different religions, different personalities, but what was common was that everyone had to sign a contract to commit to socialize at least 2 hours every week with the neighbors. So it's also a nice example of how the built environment can play a role. And in fact, as has been said many times today already, a lot of the interventions that we also came across, they really targeted older adults. But we were also happy to identify a couple of examples of interventions for young people. And this is one of them. Join Us is a foundation in the Netherlands, and they are working on an intervention to reduce loneliness among young people who report to be chronically lonely. And what is interesting about this Join Us program is that they are implementing it together with municipalities. So there's already some 50 municipalities in the Netherlands who are working together with them. So what does it mean in practice? It means that the young people can be referred to this program, for instance, through schools or social workers or home doctors. And what they do is to focus on social skills development and really promoting young people the skills that they can develop and maintain social relationships. And while many interventions really focus on the social aspects and social networks and bringing people together, then some interventions really focus on the individual. One of examples in that area comes from Helsinki Missio, which is a non-profit in Finland, which has the mission to address loneliness across all age groups. And they are running an individualized approach to reduce loneliness. And what is interesting about this intervention is that they are using a rich set of follow-up measurements. So they basically measure loneliness using some of these scales that we have been discussing today, and also well-being of the participants, both before and after the intervention. And they have got some good results on the effectiveness. And in fact, one of the key takeaways from our work with interventions so far, and which has been mentioned already today, is that there is really a need for more evaluations, more built-in high-quality evaluations of interventions. It's really a great step to already have this kind of pre-post measurement of participants in these interventions. But of course, then ideally, the participants taking part in the interventions could be compared to a control group of individuals who didn't take part. And yeah, we want to learn more what works for whom and in which context. And of course, we fully acknowledge that a lot of these interventions across Europe are implemented by NGOs and small organizations. So they cannot always be something costly to be added to the interventions. Yet what we try to do with our research is also to promote that kind of mindset of evaluations and thinking about the impact already from the design of the intervention work. And good examples are out there. There is more. We only have time to mention a couple. But another interesting example in this regard is the global project Resetas, which looks at how nature in the cities can actually help to reduce loneliness. So they talk about nature prescription, I think. And they are building into the study, which is a 5-year project, 3 observation studies, but also randomized controlled trials. And this is an interesting project because it's in 6 different cities worldwide, one of them being Marseille in France. And an additional perspective for this intervention work comes from the EU-wide survey on loneliness, first of its kind, that we are conducting this year at the JRC, as Elisabeth was mentioning. And this survey also gives us the opportunity to really add knowledge to the intervention work and really look at the demand side. We want to learn through this survey also, what do people who experience loneliness actually do to reduce their feelings of loneliness? We are also really curious to learn whether Europeans are aware of initiatives and programs addressing loneliness, because that can be also one issue. What if lonely people don't know that these programs exist? And finally, we really want to learn Europeans' views on the role of different actors. What should different actors do to reduce loneliness, whether it's governments or NGOs or employers, businesses, or the individuals themselves? So this is something we are very excited about and will be reporting back later this year. So next steps, very briefly, as mentioned, we will continue with all these different activities this year, and our work on interventions will really culminate in a roundtable with experts in October. And next year also, the entire JRC loneliness project will be wrapped up in a big event. So we will keep you all posted and hope to see you all there. And finally, please get in touch. We would love to hear your feedback and exchange. And here you can see our loneliness team pictures from JRC. And yeah, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I think we have time for about one question.
I have a very quick one.
Very good.
So hi, Anna. Hi, Elizabeth. Nice to see you. Just a quick question on the mapping activity. You had mentioned that you were doing so to see what was working in the nations. Is there an evaluation piece to that mapping, or is it just descriptive of what's happening in each of the nations?
Do you want to take it?
Yeah, I can take it. So thank you, Eddie, for this question. No, unfortunately, we're not planning to do, we don't have a guideline for the evaluation for those interventions, but we certainly are looking at whether that specific intervention we're looking at, or the interventions in the EU, do actually have an evaluation built in, and does it actually tell us, is it working or not? Yes. So I don't know if, Nina, you want to add anything about that?
I think you covered. Thanks.
And I think also the presentation gives enough ground also for the discussion that we're having
Absolutely.
after this talk to continue this discussion. So thank you again, Nina and Elizabeth. Next up, we'll have Chris Mixon. Chris is coming here from the radio show to present about the work that they're doing on evidence gap. I've got a couple of questions.
What is the...
Okay. Be nice, but yeah.
What I wanted to do is, so open science framework, I wanted to share them there and then link them from our
Good. Yeah. Est-ce que je peux accéder à Internet? Parce que j'ai un lien, j'aimerais montrer quelque chose sur Internet, mais...
Là, je sais pas.
Ah, sinon, c'est pas grave. Sinon, je peux le faire sans.
Je peux... Là, c'est possible, je pense. Puis on...
Non, en fait, j'ai déjà un lien
Ah,
dans la diapo.
Ok, bah là, on n'a pas Internet.
Non, d'accord, je le ferai pas, c'est pas grave. C'est plus facile même si je le fais pas. Ça, je vais pas me couper. C'est bon, merci. Trying to figure it out. Okay, good. Can you hear me? Yes, vous pouvez m'entendre?
You have to press, I think.
Maintenant, vous pouvez m'entendre. Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everybody. First of all, I'd like to say it's a pleasure to be here and I'd like to thank the organizers, Hans, and the rest of the organizers for inviting WHO to participate in the conference today. I'm going to talk about building on what Elizabeth and Mina just went over. Talk about interventions, the effectiveness of interventions, mapping the evidence for interventions and identifying gaps. And I'll tell you a little bit about our plans to develop what we're calling an evidence architecture. This is an outline of my presentation. We've only started working, as I said earlier, on this issue about a year ago. So for WHO, it's still very much early days. But what I'm going to tell you about is going to be an important component of our work going forward. So I'll start by explaining briefly why building up the evidence is important. Then I'll just suggest that it might be a good idea to go beyond the idea of an evidence base to that of an evidence architecture, and I'll briefly outline what that is. And then I'll describe our current and planned activities in relation to building up this evidence architecture, focusing on the evidence and gap maps we're currently developing, the guidelines we've just started working on, which will be based on a series of systematic reviews, and then the online portal we'll hope to develop a little bit further down the line. And I'll finish by explaining how this evidence architecture will feed into this commission on social connection we're thinking of establishing, which Etienne Krug earlier this morning talked about. I'll explain a little bit more about that commission towards the end of the presentation. So, I mean, the main reason why building up the evidence is so important, and these are to borrow the words of Howard White, who used to be the head of the Campbell collaboration until recently, most interventions don't work, most interventions aren't evaluated, and most evaluations are not used. As a result, billions of dollars of money from governments and individual donations is wasted on ineffective programs. And you can read the whole article at this link here. I think it's an excellent article, and I draw on it quite a bit here. He also mentions the 80% rule in this article. 80% of things, and he's really referring to social interventions, don't work. And he gives a few examples. In the field of education, about 88% of randomized controlled trials had weak or no positive effects. These are data from the States. In the area of employment and training, 75% of RCTs had weak or no positive effects. And Google and Microsoft have conducted thousands of RCTs on new products, on new strategies, and they found no significant effects in over 80% of cases. There might be some cherry picking going on here. It may not be an 80% rule in all areas. It may be a 60, 50, maybe even a 40% rule. But it really doesn't change, I think, the fact that unless we have rigorous evidence proving our interventions work, we should either assume they don't work or that a significant proportion of them don't work, and we're just wasting our time and money. So let's say a few words about this notion of evidence architecture and how it differs from, it encompasses, but kind of goes beyond the notion of an evidence base. And this is also taken from that article by Howard White. And the purpose of an evidence architecture is to institutionalize the use of evidence in policy and in practice. So it's really to ensure that all this evidence we're producing, once it's beautifully synthesized in systematic reviews and other ways, actually gets used. And it's made up of two components, as you can see on the slide, these two multicolor triangles. And the supply side starts with raw data, primary studies, and then a whole series of different evidence synthesis products, starting with systematic reviews, which summarize the findings of multiple studies, databases, evidence maps, and I'll say more about evidence maps in a minute, evidence platforms, evidence portals, guidelines, and again, I'll say more about guidelines, and checklists. But there's an increasing recognition, but just creating this evidence and making it available is not enough. You also need this other component that tries to stimulate demand for evidence and then channel this demand for evidence. And this side is made up of things like an evidence ecosystem assessment, the use of evidence workshops to engage communities of users, evidence needs assessments, and evidence-based budgets, where money is only allocated to programs that have evidence supporting them. And that's the case in the States and to an extent in some Scandinavian countries. So what we're aiming to do over the next years is to build up such an evidence architecture for the field of social isolation and loneliness. And we hope to do this with other partners here, Global Initiative on Loneliness and Connection, the European Commission's Joint Research Centre, and one of the main partners we've been working with is a Campbell collaboration. I don't know if you're all aware of the Campbell collaboration. It's like the Cochrane collaboration, which tries to synthesize evidence in the area, Cochrane, of clinical medicine. The Campbell collaboration synthesizes evidence and makes it available in the other areas, such as education, social welfare, crime and justice, development, and so forth. So what we're doing at the moment and what our plans in the kind of medium term are as follows here. We're finishing a first evidence and gap map on digital interventions to reduce social isolation and loneliness among older people. And we started on a second evidence and gap map on in-person interventions. That's all other interventions except for digital interventions, but this time across all age groups. And that's because we started on working on only older people, and we decided we want to expand to all age groups, and we'd already started this project. It's a bit unfortunate, but that's the way it goes. Then we're going to develop guidelines, and I'll tell you about those, that will be based on a series of systematic reviews. And then, as I said, we hope to develop this evidence portal. In terms of the demand side, we're actually just starting on an evidence ecosystem assessment in this field. And then once the evidence and gap maps, the systematic reviews, the guidelines and other things are available, we want to run some use of evidence workshops around the world so people can learn how to use this evidence. This is the latest draft of our evidence and gap map on interventions for reducing social isolation and loneliness in older adults. I was hoping I could show you, kind of demonstrate all the different things that it includes on the internet. Does that work? No, it's not going to work. It's okay. I can do it without the internet. So I'll just point out a few features of this, as many other features, but in the rows, you have the different types of interventions. And I'm trying to, it's very small here. We have interventions for improving social skills, and then these are subdivided by other interventions. That's for training and how to use technology, for example. We've classified them in 4 or 5 categories with subcategories. For this evidence and gap map on digital interventions, we haven't used the broader socio-ecological model. We've only focused basically on the individual and relationship level. That's because most of the interventions were only on the individual and relationship level. For the evidence and gap map we're doing on in-person interventions, there we'll address all the different levels of the socio-ecological model: individual, relationship, community, societal, and so forth. So rows, you have the interventions. Columns, you have outcomes, social isolation, loneliness, and a whole series of other related outcomes. And in each of these cells, you have the quantity and the quality of available information for that intervention in relation to its impact on that outcome. And here would be, can you see it? Yeah, you can see it better than me. That would be training in how to use digital technology, the amount of evidence for the effectiveness of that intervention to reduce social isolation. And the green circles indicates the quality of the amount of reviews, green and blue, and green indicates low quality reviews, blue high quality reviews, in orange it's a randomized controlled trials, etc. And if you press on this, you get a list of all the reviews that are summarized, and with a link to the abstract, link to the full text if it's available. So that just gives you a sense of what these are about. And then you can also, there's a filter button here, you can press on that, and then you can filter according to different variables. For example, you can show only the randomized controlled trials, or only the studies in a certain region of the world, or in a certain country, and there are many, many different options by which you can select these. Okay, so just it's important to emphasize that these evidence and gap maps say what evidence there is, not what the evidence says, right? So this is, the evidence and gap maps are just a first step in the construction of this evidence architecture. And they don't synthesize the findings. That's systematic reviews, reviews of reviews, other evidence synthesis products. But they still serve a number of important purposes. First, they increase the discoverability and use of this evidence, particularly by policymakers, decision makers, program commissioners, practitioners. Secondly, they guide implementing agencies around the world away from interventions for which there's no evidence and towards interventions that are supported by at least some evidence. Third, they help us produce higher level evidence synthesis products like reviews of reviews and guidelines. And fourth, they help us identify gaps in the research, and they help us commission research in a more strategic and more coordinated way. Just some findings from this first evidence and gap map we're doing on digital interventions for older people. We did systematic searches across multiple databases in multiple languages. It's actually current head of the Cochrane collaboration at the University of Ottawa who's doing this, and they have a team speak different languages. We had a Chinese team help us and so on. We found that in this area, digital interventions to reduce social isolation and loneliness for older people, we found that there are 97 systematic reviews, which was a relatively large number. We weren't expecting quite that many. And there are almost as many reviews as primary studies, 103 primary studies. And this is typical, actually, in the health sciences. There are as many reviews as there are primary studies. I don't know what that says about the health sciences, but that's the way it is. Of the primary studies, we found that 81 of the 103 were randomized controlled trials, which is a pretty large proportion are randomized controlled trials. The rest are non-randomized. Of the reviews, these 97 reviews, 70 were of critically low quality. So here there's really room for improvement. 70 out of the 97 are of critically low quality. This shows the distribution of primary studies by country in the world. And you see that most of them have been done in the States. That's over 30 studies have been done in the States, 20 to 30 in the Anglo-Saxon world, Canada, UK, and Australia, fewer in Europe and Asia, and none in large parts, most of Africa except South Africa, parts of the Middle East, and South Africa. So this gives you a sense of where the evidence is coming from. And I don't think this is simply an artifact of our search strategy, because we search multiple databases in multiple languages. I don't think we got all of them, but this is probably roughly representative of reality, I think. This is just another one. We've got 40 of these charts, so I'm just giving you a few of them to give you a taste of what these evidence and gap maps can show. This is the proportion of primary studies on the different types of broad interventions. We categorized them by interventions that aim to enhance social support, and there were 48% of the primary studies were evaluating those kind of interventions, and so forth, you can see here. So that's the evidence and gap maps. We've just starting work now on a set of guidelines that will, as I said, will be based on systematic reviews, and developing such global guidelines, mainly for ministries of health, but not only, is really one of the core functions of WHO. This is really kind of our bread and butter activity. We do this all the time. It's an expensive, arduous, and time-consuming task, but still, this is what we do much of the time. These guidelines provide clear and evidence-based recommendations for clinical practice and for public health policy. And these are just some examples of recent guidelines WHO has produced. There's one on abortion care guidelines. Just pick out a few. There's another on WHO guidelines on the control and elimination of human schistosomiasis. And we have dozens of these guidelines on all kinds of different topics. This is a process by which we develop these guidelines. As I said, it takes usually about 3 years, costs at least $500,000, and there are dozens of people involved. Start by setting up a steering group, setting up a guidelines development group, then formulating the questions, and then we come to really the crucial part of this activity, and that's retrieving, assessing, and synthesizing the evidence. And this is done on the basis of systematic reviews. We try to identify all the high-quality recent systematic reviews. If there are not enough systematic reviews on certain topics, we commission them. And then we bring all this together and we summarize the evidence using something called the grade approach. And then we try to derive clear recommendations that can be used by, for example, ministries of health. So I said that systematic reviews are at the heart of this. I just want to explain what systematic reviews are, but I think this has already been explained. Just say two things about them, is that they're generally considered to be at the top of what's called a hierarchy of scientific evidence in this area, and that in the area of social isolation and loneliness, as I said, in relation to digital interventions, we found 97 systematic reviews. So there really are already a very large number of systematic reviews in this area. And then the challenge is to synthesize the results of all these systematic reviews. This is an example of a recent excellent systematic review entitled "Are Loneliness Interventions Effective in Reducing Loneliness?" A meta-analytic review of 128 studies by Mathias Lasgaard and colleagues in Denmark. And it was just submitted for publication. And on the basis of 128 studies they meta-analyzed, they came to the conclusion that loneliness interventions reduce evidence to a small or moderate degree. They found small to moderate effect sizes. They found that the different intervention strategies, and I think they categorized them into 4 or 5 as I remember, the different intervention strategies all had similar effects. It was hard to distinguish between them, though there were indications that their category of psychological treatment may have worked a little bit better than their category of social network interventions. Those were interventions that tried to increase the opportunity for social interaction. So currently, it's not really possible to identify a specific type of intervention that works better than others, or a particular age group for which these interventions work better. And they conclude that the evidence base is currently limited, many small studies with weak study designs, the target groups are often unclear, and the results are inconsistent. And this very much echoes the conclusion of a review of the evidence we did we published last summer, where we concluded that many interventions and strategies have shown promise, but we do not yet know which are the most effective and for whom, and we concluded that we need higher quality evaluations to produce more conclusive evidence at this point. I won't say much about this online portal because it won't be happening right away, but once we've done the evidence and gap maps, the systematic reviews, the guidelines, we'll try to bring this all together in an accessible way, distill all this evidence, mainly for policymakers and decision makers. finish now with a few words about this commission on social connection and how this evidence architecture we're in the process of developing is going to contribute to this commission. So this commission on social connection, its overarching aim will be to increase the visibility and political priority of this issue, and also to speed up the development and uptake of cost-effective interventions. Not only effective, they also have to be, unfortunately, cost-effective. And it'll be composed of commissioners. These are kind of well-known people in the field or related to this field. We expect to have something like 10 to 15 of them. At the top there, you can see them. There'll be a secretariat, and there'll also be an advisory board. And we hope this commission will generate 4 main outputs: a commission report, where we make the case for addressing this issue, where we synthesize all the evidence, and where we make recommendations for action based on this evidence. We're also going to develop an intervention accelerator. That will really be a network of interventionists that get together to try to speed up the development and the scaling up of these interventions. We are intending to develop a global index on social connection so we can monitor social connection around the world, track the progress countries are making, and advocacy activities which may include some kind of feature documentary to increase awareness of this issue. This evidence architecture is really going to provide the syntheses of the evidence required for this commission report. It's going to guide the development of these the interventions in the intervention accelerator, and it will act as a resource for the commissioners and for the advisory board. So it's going to play a key role in the development of this commission. I'll finish now with a few words of conclusion. I think that developing this architecture is really a critical task for this field. I mean, without cost-effective interventions, without cost-effective policies, no amount of visibility, no amount of political priority, no amount of resources are really going to allow us to reduce social isolation and loneliness significantly globally. So I think this is really a key part of this, this game at this point. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris, for this truly wonderful presentation. And I think we're also at the last scientific talk of the day. We kind of went full circle where Dominique Muller started, and director of the lab, also the quality of evidence. So that's something that you addressed again today. Do we have questions for Chris? Ron?
Excellent presentation, Chris. One of the things that Julian brought up in an earlier conversation about the quality of the conceptual frameworks, of the definitions. Are you wrestling with that as you develop architecture? And where do you see gaps there? I noticed you had the term social connectedness. I know you and I talked about that a little bit, but you know, the term social connectedness, the term loneliness, how does that come up in your review studies and the review of the reviews in your analysis?
It comes up very prominently and very bothersomely. No, we just had a meeting with the European Commission Joint Research Centre, with Julian and with Eddie, to try to see if we could move towards some kind of common taxonomy of interventions. And I think this will be kind of an ongoing process. I think everybody agrees that some kind of socio-ecological model has to be adopted. Exactly how you classify the interventions within that socio-ecological model is not clear. So that's something we're working on. And when it comes to definitions, we're also struggling with that. Julian or Eddie sent me a document. I don't know if you've published it yet, where they go over these definitions. They've tried to go over the literature and come up with kind of consensual definitions. And I think they're excellent, and I'm going to strongly urge WHO to adopt them. So when you publish that, maybe the wider world will know about this. I don't think it actually addresses the term social connectedness and how it differs from social connection, if I'm
It does not.
It does not, right? I'm correct, yeah. So maybe that's something, I don't know, that could be added, we could discuss some other time. Yeah. No, but those issues that you brought up are definitely big issues, and I think there's no ideal solution to these things. So if we can get some kind of consensus and have a provisional taxonomy that can last us a few years at least.
And then next, we'll see.
Thank you, Chris. Very, very, very broad and very informative talk. My question relates somewhat to what Ron just said, that if we talk about evidence and we want to use it also to get some progress reports, then the question is indeed, what is it that we want to make a progress on? And so you talk reducing loneliness and social isolation, and only in the last slide you talk about social connection, a global index of social connection. And my question is whether indeed we don't get some kind of problem in with regard to the indicators that we use to sell the efforts that and to get funding for the efforts with regard to loneliness, and that we don't really have a sound understanding of what it is that we want to make progress on. In some way, loneliness seems to have the opposite of then social relatedness, and we also saw in the talk before by Minna a little bit social cohesion. However, shouldn't we talk more about what is at the root that we want to get at? And I think we have to look more about the social needs and the deficits in social needs that may be related to a feeling of loneliness, or that may be correlated strongly with a lack of social relations. But these needs are more varied, and they may need different aspects of the intervention. And these deficits could be somehow measured more precisely, and you would get some mileage on improvement on different social deficits. So that you have to keep talking about loneliness on the one hand, but actually in your actual research, you should probably pay more attention to what is really behind that, and I would think that maybe useful to look more at the possibility of deficits in the realization of social needs. And the discussion of what that would be, and there's of course quite a bit of that.
You said many different things, but I'll just make one remark, and that's there's no doubt that the development of interventions has to rely on a lot of solid research on risk factors, proximal, distal risk factors, causal status of these risk factors, and I don't think that evidence exists yet. So that's definitely a field that has to be developed, and many of these deficits, I think, could be considered kind of proximal risk factors or precursors of loneliness or correlates or whatever. So I think a lot of research still needs to be done on that.
I think we have time for one more question. And then we can...
Well, we'll make it two. You go ahead.
Very interesting presentation, and I'm very much looking forward to your map of interventions once it's completed.
The first one's almost done. It'll be done in a couple of weeks.
That's terrific. Mm-hmm. Could I just ask you whether it is capturing interventions where loneliness and social isolation are not the primary outcomes of that intervention. For example, various physical activity interventions, various arts interventions, where they do measure that, and it's actually, they can be quite effective, but that wasn't really the purpose of the intervention.
We discussed this at great length, and we came to a compromise, which I don't think anybody was really that happy with. What we decided to do is only include interventions that, of course, measured loneliness, social isolation, but also stated that the aim of the intervention was to reduce it, at least among its 3 or 5 primary aims. It had to state that the aim. The problem is that otherwise there'd be so many different interventions. And we thought, and maybe wrongly, that interventions that weren't designed to target loneliness or social isolation as a primary outcome were probably less likely to be effective. That may not be the case, but we made that assumption. Yeah.
Hi Chris, super amazing talk. I really loved it, and it's really exciting to see work like this, especially given the mission of the startup Hansen and I co-founded, which is the ainsi Behavioral Science Lab, which aims to bridge methodological best practices of behavioral science. So just 2 quick clarifications from her talk. One, you referred to low quality and high quality systematic reviews. How does your team make that distinction between the high quality and low quality systematic review? And then you also said that you commission systematic reviews if there's none. Do you also commission, or are you open to commissioning large-scale RCTs, especially given if the literature is full of small-scale studies?
We use, in the Campbell collaboration, uses a standard instrument to assess the quality of systematic review. It's the AmStar2, developed by Beverly Shea at the University of Ottawa. There are 4 or 5 different instruments. We looked at them, and we thought this was the best of Campbell. And I think also the Cochrane collaboration suggests you use this one, so that's why we used it. It's quite good. It's very, very detailed. In relation to commissioning RCTs, WHO sometimes does commission big multi-country studies, yes. I can't see us doing it in relation to social isolation and loneliness anytime soon, especially that there's so many systematic reviews. But yes, I know in other fields, in maternal and child health, and in many areas, WHO has been involved in, funded, helped organize large-scale multi-country trials.
So will there ever be like a WHO-funded social isolation RCT?
You know, WHO, everybody thinks WHO is swimming in money. That's not actually the case. We have to try to raise money for every one of our little projects. So it can't be ruled out, but I think it's somewhat unlikely in the near future.
All right, with that, we come together. Christoph, again, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
So then we'll get into a final discussion. This final discussion is really meant, I know that we still have some people here left here from the roundtable discussion, that we're thinking about the national working group in France, or at least some local actors within ministère and at the university, but also connecting to them internationally. This discussion will be led by Untitled, so she will be calling on some people and also connecting to international groups such as Loneliness in Europe and also the Global Initiative for Loneliness and
Thank you, Hans. So this is our final connecting